What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I am here to examine another issue of the X-Men. Today, I am examining issue 3 of the X-Men. This is written by Stan Lee, with pencils by Jack Kirby, with inks by Paul Reinman, and lettered by Art Simek, or Simek. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And this issue introduces the Blob, and I was actually surprised that I like this issue quite a bit. It does quite a bit to enhance the characters of the X-Men, kind of give them more personality traits than what they had in the first two issues. The first two issues were more about setting up this world, establishing the premise, and introducing these characters, giving us their powers. But this issue, now that we've already introduced these characters, it really tries very hard to kind of make these characters a little bit unique, so that Beast isn't exactly the same as Angel, who isn't exactly the same as Cyclops, etc. This issue makes Cyclops quite a bit more morose than all of his other teammates. Professor X even comments on that. He says that it distresses him that Cyclops is so sad. And Cyclops says as long as he has this very deadly power, he is not going to be happy, and he's even contemplating in his mind about how he loves Jean Grey, and he wishes he could be with her, but with his powers, he knows that that can't be. This is kind of sort of like Daredevil. Daredevil had a thing for Karen Page, but as long as he was blind, he knew that he couldn't be with her. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, it makes a little bit more sense with Daredevil than it does here, because all the X-Men have terrible powers that are very dangerous to those around them, but that's why they're at the Institute, so that they can learn to control their abilities. Now, Cyclops, unfortunately, is one of the only ones who cannot control his abilities. They just have the ruby quartz glasses as a stopgap measure. He can't turn it off and take his glasses off and just relax like Iceman or Angel. They don't have as dangerous abilities as Cyclops does, so it's a little bit understandable that he's kind of being all broody Heathcliff kind of here, but it's interesting that we get to see that he is in love with Jean Grey at this point. I do wish that they had played it out a little bit longer, kind of let this love develop a little bit more organically, but this was the 1960s. That didn't really happen a whole lot. In the first issue of Hulk, Hulk is already in love with Betty Ross. In the first issue of Daredevil, we actually don't get a whole lot of Karen Page in the first issue of Daredevil, so never mind that. But a lot of times these romances didn't really play out naturally over a period of time. It was just, hey, here's the love interest, and here's the other character, and they're in love with each other, and then whatever obstacles get in their way is going to prevent them from actually being a happy couple. And that's kind of what we've got going on here. And then Jean seems to have a thing for Scott, but she's not communicating that in the same way that Scott is not communicating his love for her. Angel is also developed quite a bit in this issue. He is very much the Draco Malfoy of the team. He's basically a snob. He's rich. They kind of comment on that. He mentions that he has a Rolls Royce, and he basically kidnaps Jean and says, "You're coming with me so that we can look for this new mutant that the professor has sensed." And everyone else is like, man, that Angel guy is a jerk. And I'm glad that they have actually given him a personality. Up until now, he was basically just a guy with wings. He didn't have much of a personality. Beast also finally starts being developed as the brain of the team. At one point, he's reading some literature, and he's talking with more verbose language, words that have multiple syllables, and a lot of times that gets irritating with Beast, where he will say something really long and drawn out and needlessly complicated when he could just say, yeah, sure, I'll do that. But this is starting to paint him as being a lot smarter than what he was portrayed as in the first two issues, so that's cool. And Iceman, we don't get a whole lot of development with him. In fact, he's reined in a little bit. In issue 2, he was extremely irritating. He was using his powers and acting out, acting very immature, acting like a 5-year-old. He doesn't do that as much here. He's still kind of portrayed as being the younger of the group, still not quite as mature as the other guys. At one point, Angel comes in to tell him that the professor needs them to suit up and get ready for the Blob and his people attacking them, and Iceman was getting an ice cream sundae ready, and Angel's like, hey, what are you doing in here? You were supposed to be studying. So he's still not quite as mature as the others, but he's not acting like a little child here like he was in issue 2, so that's nice to see. Also, this issue introduces Professor X's unrequited love for Jean Grey. This is something that is introduced here. I don't think it's ever brought up again until the 1990s. I believe Mark Waid was the writer who brought it up again during the Onslaught saga, but before that, I don't think that this was ever brought up again. A lot of people, and I mentioned this in issue 1, a lot of people think that this is really gross, and it is gross, but Professor X is not as old as a lot of people think. By my math, he would have been born sometime shortly after the development of the first atomic bomb, which started in 1942, I believe, and this comic actually took place in January 1960. 1964, I think. And the first X-Men comic was, I believe, September of 1963. So Professor X is like 21 here, and Jean Grey is like 17 or 18. So the age gap is not that huge. It's still a little bit gross because Professor X is an authority figure and Jean Grey is his student. So it's still a little bit icky that he has this love for her, but they pretty much immediately do away with that after this issue. I don't know if they just felt like everyone on the team having a thing for Jean was just a little bit gross and they didn't want to go in that direction, or if maybe they just felt like having Angel and Scott both having a thing for Jean was enough. Because by this point, you've still got characters who are kind of, it's almost like their love for Jean is a joke. Like Beast and Iceman, they both are like racing to go downstairs because whoever's the first one ready to go, they can go with Jean to go out in town looking for this new mutant that the professor sensed. And it's almost like they're talking about, yeah, Jean is really hot and I want to spend the day with her, but it's not like they're serious about it. Scott is serious about it and Professor X is serious about it. Angel is at least aggressive about it. He's at least ambitious in trying to spend time with her, but I don't think that he was ever truly in love with her. And that makes sense with his character as it's later developed, where he doesn't really communicate his feelings like he should, especially by the time you get to his relationship with Psylocke in the 90s, where he has trouble expressing his emotions, but that's long after he was apocalypsified. But anyway, so a lot of characterization is developed in this issue, and when I say developed, it's not like these guys feel like fully formed, fleshed out three-dimensional characters here, but it goes a long way that the first two issues did not do, and I'm really excited to see a little bit more development of these characters as this series continues. I feel like it's the first issue, and of course this series is still young yet, we're only on issue 3, but this is the first time in this series so far where all of these characters feel like, well, I'll say most of these characters feel like individual, unique characters. Iceman feels different enough from Beast that if you turned off the lights and Beast started talking and Iceman started talking, I would be able to say, okay, that's Beast talking right there, and that's Iceman talking right there. Jean Grey, unfortunately, is still just the teen girl. That's a problem that will exist in every Marvel comic except for maybe Spider-Man until the 1970s. Pretty much any comic book in the 60s where there's a girl on the team, she is not going to have much of a personality. You look at the Fantastic Four, and Reed Richards is the confident, brainy leader guy. Ben Grimm is the rough, grim, no pun intended, kind of bruiser guy from the Bronx. And then Johnny, he's the young, aggressive, hothead. He's immature. Sue Storm doesn't really have any personality. And that's something that I would say there's still kind of every writer who comes on the Fantastic Four is still trying to kind of put their own angle on Sue Storm. And I would say that that's true also for characters like Betty Ross from the Hulk. She didn't really have any personality at all in the Silver Age Hulk comics. I would say that that's true for Jean Grey here in the X-Men. I'd say that's kind of true for Janet Van Dyne from Ant-Man, although I think that she has more personality now than some of these other characters I'm mentioning. I would say the only exception to that rule would be the early Silver Age Spider-Man comics, and only there because they had multiple characters who were girls, and so I feel like they realized that they were going to have to give these characters kind of diverse personalities. And even then, it was the late 60s before they had Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane, and Betty Brant all existing in the same comic, Liz Allen. So Mary Jane acts very different than Gwen Stacy, who acts very different from Betty Brant, etc. So anyway, I feel like Jean Grey is still kind of the odd man out here who doesn't really have her own unique personality, but that was happening all over the place. It's unfortunate, but there's not really much that can be done about it now, other than like writers and creators who are trying to make female characters feel like real characters and not just the token girl. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about the bad guy of this issue, the Blob. He is working at a circus. Out of nowhere, Professor X stops the X-Men from what they're doing and says, I sent a new mutant. You guys have to go out there and find this new mutant. Early in the X-Men comics, it's hinted that there are not that many mutants. Much later on, like around issue 50 or so, pretty much all of the mutants on Earth are kidnapped by the Sentinels, and there's only like a dozen mutants, and later on still, like in the early to mid 70s, it implies that there are many more mutants than what it is implied in the first 60 or so issues of this series. Right now, it's implied that there's like 10 mutants across the entire planet, and that will, of course, be retconned again and again the further that we get into the series, because we can't have the same 3 bad guys all the time. So every time there's a new bad guy, it's going to be a new mutant. But right now, it's implying that a new mutant that Professor X senses is a really big deal. And he doesn't have Cerebro here. That's another interesting thing, is how long it will take Professor X to develop some of the technology that we take for granted in current X-Men status quo. In issue 2, I didn't talk about this in yesterday's video, but in issue 2, Professor X actually had to contact his in guy at the FBI, Agent Duncan, who had this weird metallic band around his head so that he could receive Professor X's mental communication. And that's something that, if you did an X-Men comic today and Jean Grey needed to talk to someone on the other side of the planet, you wouldn't do any of that technological stuff. She would just talk to them with her telepathy. And so it's interesting to see that right here, Professor X does not have Cerebro. He's not looking for a new mutant with his special X-Men machine. He just happens to sense a new mutant. And so all the X-Men just go out in their cities looking for this new mutant. We get a couple of kind of silly gags here where Iceman sees a guy who's shooting fire from his hands, and he's like, ooh, that must be the mutant. And then he looks closer, and he has a magnifying glass that he's using to set a piece of paper on fire. And then Beast sees a guy walking on the air, and then he walks up the building, and it turns out it's just a part of the building that is invisible from the ground. And so it looks like he's walking on the air. And then Cyclops sees a guy who is at the circus, and he's shooting with a rifle that he's shooting behind himself. And then Cyclops sees that there's another guy behind him under this quilt thing, and he's shooting for the guy. And Cyclops is like, well, I'll teach him. And so he shoots the rifle that this other guy is shooting from. And anyway, it's Cyclops who finds the Blob, and then Cyclops says, I need to take you to the X-Men, and we do not take no for an answer. And then Jean Grey and Angel come, and they basically are treating Cyclops like scum. Like, Angel comes in, and it's, of course, obvious that Angel is going to treat him like scum because he is the Draco Malfoy of the team. And then Jean, she also kind of ignores Cyclops right there. Earlier in the issue, she was saying, like, hey, Scott, you seem kind of down. Do you want to go with me to town? And then Angel just picks her up and throws her in his car, and they go off. But then here, Angel comes in and says to the Blob, don't listen to Cyclops, you can come with us. And then Blob sees Jean, and he's interested in her. And then he goes to the X-Mansion. They test his powers a little bit, and then Professor X asks him if he wants to be an X-Man, and he says no. And then Professor X is like, well, this is unacceptable. X-Men, hold him down. I have to wipe his memories. This is the second time in 3 issues that Professor X is going to mentally mess around with a bad guy's mind. This is, again, very unethical. I talked about this a little bit in yesterday's video, and this time it is 100% Professor X's fault that he is in this scenario. At least in the previous issue, the Vanisher just came out of nowhere and said, I'm going to start stealing stuff with my mutant powers, and then Professor X did the best that he could in trying to put a patch on that problem. Here, the Blob wasn't hurting anyone. The Blob had his own life at the carnival. He wasn't going out terrorizing anybody, and then the X-Men essentially force him to go with them to the X-Mansion. Cyclops says, we will not take no for an answer, and then when they get there, he's a little bit of a jerk, but it's not like he's terrorizing anybody or anything. Iceman says, this guy needs to be taken down a peg or two. Can I do it? And Professor X is like, sure. And so Iceman attacks the Blob, and then the Blob says, I'm not interested in joining you guys. And then Professor X says, well, we need to wipe his memories. All very unethical, totally uncalled for. And then this is what turns the Blob into a supervillain. He goes back to the carnival and gets all of the people working there to go and attack the X-Mansion in what is a very comical scene. These normal circus people who do not have any superhuman abilities except for the Blob, they are able to hold their own with the X-Men. That's kind of ridiculous. At one point when Angel, he went into Iceman's room to tell him, hey, the professor needs you, and Iceman had that ice cream sundae, a giraffe just shoots its neck into Iceman's room and starts eating the sundae. It's really ridiculous. It's very funny. I'm not entirely sure if they meant for it to be comical, but it's pretty funny now. But anyway, the X-Men, much like in issue 2, where they didn't really do anything to defeat the bad guy, they're kind of superfluous here. Once again, Professor X is the guy who comes in and saves the day. And if you're wondering why most of the X-Men movies tried very hard to contrive a way to get rid of Professor X in those stories so that the X-Men could save the day, well, you're looking at the reason right here, because 2 out of 3 issues here so far, Professor X is the one who comes in and messes around with the bad guy's mind so that they won't be a threat anymore. And I'm pretty sure we won't see a whole lot of that for a while, but you do have to wonder, why doesn't Professor X do that all the time? That's something that I asked in yesterday's video, and it's still a valid question today, I think. in this video. Anyway, I'm not going to be as hard on the X-Men being superfluous here in this battle as I was in yesterday's look at issue 2, because I do like that this issue does quite a bit to expand the personalities of the X-Men. A lot of times you will hear people talk about the X-Men as being a soap opera with superpowers, especially once you get to the Claremont stuff in the late 70s and 80s, but right here you're starting to see a little bit of that in the 60s, where Scott, he has a thing for Jean, but he can't tell her because he's afraid that he could do her harm with his superhuman powers. Professor X also has a thing for Jean, but he can't tell her because he's her mentor and she's his student. And then you've got Angel, who's kind of getting in the way of the Scott-Jean thing. There's a little bit of that kind of soap operatic status going on here, and I'm interested in seeing more of that, but from what I remember of reading these issues before, I know that there isn't that much of it in the first 66 or so issues. So anyway, I like this issue. This kind of dials back on the human beings, the Homo sapiens, kind of hero worshipping the X-Men. That's something that I failed to talk about in yesterday's video about issue 2, but the humans in issue 2 were all over the X-Men. Like, there was 5 girls trying to get a kiss from the Angel, and there were people shaking hands with Cyclops saying, like, "You're Cyclops of the X-Men, we really like you." And that's something that this series is kind of back and forth on in the Silver Age, where in issue 1, Professor X tells Jean that people are going to be afraid of you, and then at the end of issue 1, the general guy says that he salutes the X-Men and he will honor them in his name. And then in issue 2, you've got people who are all over the X-Men, and apparently they are celebrities in this city. This issue kind of dials back on that a little bit. We don't get to see as much of their relationship with the public. We do get to see that Blob knows who they are whenever Cyclops introduces himself to Blob, but we don't get to see as much of the humans, the non-powered Homo sapiens, kind of throwing around the X-Men's name as big-time superheroes. So we will kind of keep an eye on that as the series progresses. Are people going to be scared of the X-Men, or are they going to treat them just like the Fantastic Four and the Avengers? So anyway, I don't think that I have anything else to say about this issue. The Blob is a character that we will see quite a bit more of in this series, more than we will the Vanisher, but he is still, I would consider him to be kind of a C-list character. He's never anything more than just a thug who works for somebody else after this issue. He does kind of hold his own in this issue a little bit, but every other time that we see him, usually he's working for someone like Mystique or Exodus. He's in some version of the Brotherhood most of the time, taking orders from somebody else, because basically, if we're being honest, his power is that he's really fat. He can't be moved. Okay, that's kind of a cool power, but it's not very useful, as we see here, because he has to keep his feet planted on the ground. So it's purely a defensive ability. There's absolutely nothing offensive about it unless somebody shoots at him and then the bullet bounces off of him and hits the person that shot at him. So anyway, this is a character who, he's okay. Apparently he struck a nerve with some people enough that he was able to come back several more times throughout the years, but he's not one of my favorite villains that we have in the X-Men world. But I do say that he's probably better liked than the Vanisher. So anyway, those are my thoughts on issue 3. I hope that you guys like this video, and I will be back sometime later this week to talk about issue 4, which is going to have the return of Magneto and the introduction of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. So in the meantime, consider this issue of the X-Men examined.